Hi, thanks for joining again in our study on the fruit of the Spirit. Today we're going to be continuing in this particular study on our relationship with our fellow man and how the fruit of the Spirit helps us as we have interactions with one another and what God is developing in us as far as the kind of people that He calls upon His people, to be. We saw there where in our first three, when we talked about love, joy, and peace, and how those reflect in our relationship with God. And so in our relationship with our fellow man, we notice that the Holy Spirit shows us long-suffering, kindness, and goodness. And as we look at that, of course, we begin with our relationship of long-suffering, and that's what we're going to be concerning ourselves with today. Now, just like the others, these are truly divine traits that God has and that He wants us to have in us. And, He's seeking to develop these in us. And that's what His Word that's been inspired by the Holy Spirit, does. It helps not only teach us what we need to be, but helps us in developing that, gives us the means, the tools to do that. So we've been looking at those as well as we consider here what God is wanting to develop in us that would reflect He Himself, reflect the Spirit of God as being described here as the fruit of the Spirit, and that being the product, what the Spirit, produces. Now, in the flesh we have empathy with others. And our empathy usually kind of comes with this, I know how you feel about that. I had this, or that, happen, or I did this, or I did that. And so, it's much easier to have empathy and thus to be patient and enduring or long-suffering with others, especially when it's something that we can really, associate with. Over here in Hebrews chapter 5, beginning at verse 1, the Hebrew writer says, "For every high priest being taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can bear gently with the ignorant and erring, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity." So we see here he says, he can do that. This priest can do this on our behalf, or under the old law on their behalf, because he can have empathy with them, having his own weaknesses and having his own infirmities of the flesh. And so that's one that we can look at and we go, well, yeah, that really shouldn't be all that difficult then to practice and to participate in. But that does reflect what God's able to do. But notice here, 1 Timothy 1, verse 16, Paul says, "Now, however, for this reason I obtained mercy, that in me first Jesus Christ might show all long-suffering, as a pattern to those who are going to believe on Him for everlasting life." Now, if you know the history of Paul, you know that the Lord really did have to be long-suffering with him in order for him to come to the point to where that he would come to believe, because he was pretty mean to Christians. He was pretty mean to the people of God and persecuted them quite severely. And so we can look at that and go, well, yeah, I can understand, how the Lord has to be long-suffering with us because, well, maybe I wasn't as bad as Paul, though, and it kind of gets to, so you didn't have to put up quite with as much out of me as you did Paul. We might think, in our reasoning and speaking with the Lord. But what I'd like for us to think about here and to note here is like when we read there from Hebrews 5, it says he was able to, because he can look at that and he goes, yeah, I've made those mistakes. I've done that. Now, when we think about God and that God's not even tempted to sin, that He then can be long-suffering with us in our shortcomings and our frailties and sometimes tolerating as far as, enduring with it to a longer point of time than what would seem to be reasonable to wait for a person. Now, we must understand God's long suffering is not ever suffering, as one has said, but nonetheless, he's waited much longer maybe than what we would, even though he's not ever suffering, not going to always just tolerate it, but he would for quite some period of time. So what about if somebody is struggling with something that we've never struggled with and it just hadn't been a problem for us? I don't know if you've ever, been trying to help maybe, a young person or a small child or something, and they're trying to do something, and you just go, well, here, just let me do it, just, put them out of the way, move them out of the way, and say, no, I'll just do that. And it's hard to wait on somebody to do something that, we're seasoned in, that we can do something quite easily and simply, and maybe hadn't ever been a problem with us at all. And now, to be long-suffering. But see, that's one of the characteristics of God. That's, a bit who God is. He's put up with things out of us that he himself, cannot really associate with. And so we need to, as well, learn that same kind of long suffering. Notice here, 1 Thessalonians 5:14 and 15. He says, and we exhort you, and he goes through a few things there, and he says, be long suffering toward all. See that none render unto any one evil for evil, but always follow after that which is good, one toward another, and toward all. Wow. Okay. So this is something in our relationship with others that is a challenge, and yet we find that if we are walking with the Spirit, that we then, will also live in the same way that the Spirit does. We will live as God lives. And as we look down further at these other two, kindness and goodness, in reflection of our relationship with one another, we'll be able to notice there, then come back to, well, then, how can we do this? And of course, one way is as we've just seen today, is we've got to consciously reflect on it and say, well, yeah, that may not be my problem, but God was long-suffering with me in what was my problem. And therefore, we take on a certain heart and a certain characteristic and be able to be long-suffering. But we'll discover some other tools that helps us in being kind and good, but also would also help us in our long-suffering. Thank you so much for participating with us in this study today. Hope that we would continue with this idea and with this understanding to live in the Spirit and to walk in the Spirit.